So as you may recall, in 1984, after Deep Purple had been kind of in exile for years and years, they got back together and they put out an album, and it's this one right here that you're looking at. It's called Perfect Strangers. And what they had done is they'd actually brought the Mark II version of the band, which is these guys, back, and then they put this new album out. The Mark II version of the band, they were the band that just had all the big, kind of the really well-known hits, especially Smoke on the Water, which is the song that every human being on the planet has heard that guitar riff before. Anyway, that was this group of guys. And they had started falling apart back in 1973. What happened was Ian Gillan left the band, and then Roger Glover, the bass player. So Ian Gillan was the singer. He left the band. Roger Glover, the bass player, he left the band. And then it wasn't long before Richie Blackmore, who was the guitarist, left the band, and they kind of fizzled. You know, they grabbed Glenn Hughes joined and David Coverdale joined, and they had some. Actually, they put out some great stuff with those guys in the group. But it started fizzling and it started changing. And even though, in my opinion, the music they were putting out with David Coverdale, even all the way to the end, the stuff they did with Tommy Bolin and Come Taste the Band, it's actually a great album, but it just collapsed. And ultimately, David Coverdale left, and he started Whitesnake, and then Whitesnake kind of became for all intents and purposes, was a spin-off of Deep Purple, because it was only a few years later that John Lord from Deep Purple joined Whitesnake, and Ian Pace from Deep Purple joined Whitesnake. So anyway, and then Whitesnake did its thing for a while, and then the Mark II version, which was Roger Glover, Richie Blackmore, Ian Gillan, John Lord, Ian Pace, got back together and put this album out. And amazingly, they ended up having a couple of hits off of this album, a couple songs that got a lot of radio play. And I remember I bought this when it came out. I was into Deep Purple in the sense that I was kind of in the process of discovering all the stuff that they'd put out in the early 70s. I had bought a best of album that was called Deepest Purple, and I started exploring them, and then this came out, and then I went and saw them in concert on this tour, and I just fell in love, and then I just became fascinated with all things Deep Purple, especially because they have the most interesting family tree of just about any band ever, because when you follow all the branches and all the directions they go, you can connect the guys in this group to almost anyone. It's really kind of fun. Anyway, so this article here, it's called Deep Purple is Back with Tour and New LP. And like I said, this is from February 1st, 1985, and I think you'll enjoy listening to this. So it says, Deep Purple was born in England in 1968 and died in 1976. The lineup that made 6 albums and brought the group to fame is back together with a new LP and a single out and a world tour. Basis, and like I said a second ago, that's what we commonly know as Deep Purple Mark II. Mark I was just a slightly different group. It had a different singer and a different bass player, and they had the song that you would have heard that they put out that became pretty famous. They had a version of Hush, 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 thought I heard it telling my name, now hush, hush. Anyway, that was them. Bassist Roger Glover visited Polygram Records' office to talk about all of this between the tour's first lap, Australia, and 3 months touring the United States. Then comes Japan, Europe, a return here onto South America for a big finish in Rio de Janeiro in September. Then they'll take a vacation. But at one time in their career, they would have been sent right back out on the road. Glover says that's what he did in Deep Purple. Quote, "We didn't stop working. In 1972, we did 6 tours of America." That's crazy to think about. In 1972, they did 6 tours of America, a tour of Japan, and wrote and made an album. He said, "Silly little things that normally you'd work out never got worked out because of the amount of pressure on us to perform concerts. John Lord said it was death by 1,000 cuts. Everybody got tired of everybody. Ian Gillan was the first to say he was leaving. I decided to leave at the same time." And again, like I said a minute ago, that was back in 1973. So the last album that they put together as Mark II, I actually got it out here, is this one right here. It's called Deep Purple, Who Do We Think We Are? And the song that got pretty popular on this one, which is actually a really cool song, Woman from Tokyo, is a great, great tune. There's a lot of great stuff on all these albums. But anyway, this right here, though, was the last album that they did as Mark II prior to this one coming out, a little over a decade later. I decided to leave the same time. I thought it would be easier on the others. They carried on a while with replacements. Then Richie Blackmore left 18 months later. They carried on with a replacement for him as well. The whole thing folded in 1976. So when Richie Blackmore left, there was only one Deep Purple album that came out that without Richie Blackmore, and it was this one right here called "Come Taste the Band." And you can see that there's John Lord and Ian Pace, but they had replaced a couple albums earlier the bassist with Glenn Hughes. Of course, there's David Coverdale. And then somebody that only appeared on this album and kind of over the years has become something of a legend in his own right is Tommy Bolin. I'm from Denver, Colorado, and he was a native of that area up in Boulder. Or it wasn't a native, but I mean that's where everybody knows him from. And so if you're from Colorado, you just kind of know about him because he's kind of a legend there. And then, the hometown guy goes and joins Deep Purple, and then he put out this album, Come Taste the Band. You can see right here, I bought it as a cutout just because it didn't get the recognition that a lot of these did, because I think a lot of people looked at this and go, this isn't even Deep Purple. But the reality of it is this album had some pretty rockin' stuff on it. And not only did David Coverdale sing, but also Glenn Hughes is a great singer in his own right, and he sings on this album. You actually hear Glenn Hughes' voice on other Deep Purple albums, but I mean he's all over this one. And even on one song for a couple, I can't remember which one it was, but there's a couple of verses in a couple lines in one of the songs that he actually sings lead on. Tommy Bolin actually, he sang just a couple of lines in the song Dealer. And when you hear his voice, if you're familiar with Tommy Bolin, you instantly know, you go, you wouldn't even have to know he's in the band. He has this really unique, there's no way to really describe it, but you'd hear his voice and you're like, that sounds just like Tommy Bolin. Anyway, he sings a little bit in the song Dealer. The album, there's some really, really, in my opinion, some great stuff on this album. Okay. Let's see, whole thing folded in 1976. Glover's last day was an Osaka, Japan concert, June 29th, 1973. It was an emotional and traumatic experience, he said. I didn't want to leave. I didn't want the way it was going. Being in a band like Deep Purple was like winning the pools. From what I understand, winning the pools is a British thing where you make money for guessing the winners of football games. Anyway, I know we have a lot of people that watch these videos over there, and if I don't have that quite right, maybe you could add something down in the notes for us. It was an incredible piece of luck to find yourself in such a monumental band. To have it turn sour on you was a trauma. It took me probably 2 years to get over being in that band. I couldn't go to a show by anybody without being uncomfortable. I felt wrong not being on stage. Guitarist Blackmore formed Rainbow. Glover eventually joined him. Keyboardist Lord and drummer Ian Pace went into Whitesnake. Vocalist Gillan had a solo career. Now the five intend to remain together. So, and it's also interesting, one of the things that, as part of that solo career that people forget about, that Ian Gillan did in the 70s, was the original recording of Jesus Christ Superstar. The one that's in the brown cover, actually Ian Gillan sang the part of Jesus in that first recording. Not the movie, not the one that got put in all the theaters. This was it was kind of a concept album that was recorded before it became that huge international sensation. And because Ian Gillan had that really, really high banshee-like voice, which is what they wanted for that character in that recording, he's the one that recorded that part for Jesus in the original Jesus Christ Superstar. Quote, I think we'd all been searching for something and none of us had found it except in the Deep Purple situation, Glover said. Musically, nothing quite gelled the same way for any of us the way it did with Deep Purple, which is an interesting statement because Ritchie Blackmore actually had a lot of success with Rainbow. Now, arguably, it didn't reach the same level that Deep Purple had, but you cannot argue with the fact that Rainbow had a long, successful career putting out a string of hits over the years. There was a lot of stuff that did really, really well. And I actually really loved Rainbow. Matter of fact, the first time most people heard of Ronnie James Dio was when he showed up with Rainbow. And then, of course, then he was with Black Sabbath after that, and then he did his solo stuff. And he was with the band Elf before that. But I mean, that Rainbow's when he really kind of gained prominence, when everybody really started hearing of him. Their album, Perfect Strangers, the one that we're talking about here, came out in November, and by January 12th. Now, so it says it came out in November. It was right there at the end of October and beginning of November. The date that I've always had is October 29th, but anyway, that's what they're saying here is it came out in November. By January 12th, had climbed to 19 with a Bullet. The first single, Knocking at Your Back Door, was 73 with a Bullet on January 12th. And Knocking at Your Back Door, I don't know if you remember this, but that song, I remember that thing got played. I was hearing that on the radio all the time. It was a pretty big hit, at least as far as the radio is concerned. We would hear that song regularly, and it was actually a really cool tune. I think Perfect Strangers was probably my favorite song on this album because it just really had that it starts out with that classic John Lord organ, and just the whole thing just feels so Deep Purple, with a little bit of Led Zeppelin mixed in there but anyway, it's such a great tune. I still to this day, I think that's my favorite thing on this album. The reunion began to take shape in 1983 when Gillan talked to Glover and Ritchie. Early last year, they met in Greenwich, Connecticut, where Glover lives. The first thing they did was jam with some traditional blues. Quote, it felt like it used to feel, Glover said. When they started writing, Glover said, quote, Ritchie was brimful of ideas, which we used. Ian Gillan and I do the lyrics. Everybody contributes stuff. It just flowed. Somebody said everyone unconsciously knew we'd get back together. I don't think I did. I was fighting it. I thought it would be an oldies trip, a let's see what the aging superstars can do now trip. It's a battle I'm now happy to lose, unquote. And I know a lot of people, when this came out, had that same idea because, again, Mark II of Deep Purple had ended over a decade earlier. And, something like Smoke on the Water was classic rock at that point. For these guys to come back, and also keep in mind, I mean, Ian Gillan, I believe, was born in 45. And John Lord, who was I think the oldest one in the band, was born, if I'm not mistaken, in 41. So all of these guys, when this album was put out, they were 40, right around the age of 40. So this really, in the world of rock stars, that's, you're getting up there. And you're competing against all the stuff that was happening at the time. I mean, think of all the new bands that were, especially in the world of heavy metal, that were coming of age at that point. And and then these guys come back in and say, here we are, and then they put this out. And I don't know that anybody could have imagined that it would have kind of the impact that it did, that it would bring this incredible sound back. I mean, because how many people were even using the organ at that point? It was such a big deal. You go back to the early 70s, and you got bands, of course, like Deep Purple, which was just John Lord and that organ, but even Uriah Heep. You think John Lord's organ was brutal and distorted. Go listen to that early stuff, but there was so much of that just raunchy, heavy organ stuff that was happening back in the early 70s, and it just wasn't around as much when you got into the 80s. And then these guys come back into the scene saying, hey, let's pull out the old instruments again. And for some reason, it just resonated. And I remember, it's so funny. I remember I heard that organ, and it was somewhere around then. I think it was my little sister was learning how to play the organ at our church. And one day I went in there with her, and I I took the organ, I turned everything up as loud as I could, and I did that da na 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 na, at the beginning of Perfect Strangers, just to hear it just to hear that sound. And all of a sudden, so many people like me were going, you know what, that's a great instrument, the organ. And we'd kind of, since it had disappeared the way it had, all of a sudden we hear John Lord playing it again. You go, whoa, that is a great instrument. And then if you saw him in concert, John Lord, that organ, he was just pushing that thing around. I mean, it was such a cool instrument. They went to Vermont last spring and wrote and recorded the album in a big ski house. Most of the big albums we ever had were made under adverse conditions. Our biggest, Machine, and you can see there's a typo here. It says machine made, but it's obviously supposed to be machine head, was recorded in a cold hotel corridor in Montreux, Switzerland, said Glover. Deep Purple went to Montreux to record in a ballroom. Before they could move their equipment in, the ballroom burned during a show by Frank Zappa. And the song that I have referenced several times right now, Smoke on the Water, is written about that event. Where the place burned down. And anyway, if you go listen to the lyrics of Smoke on the Water, I'm sure if you're watching this video, you probably already know that. But I know there are a few people like my mother who watches this stuff who probably has no idea what I'm talking about. They went to go to Montreux, Switzerland to record the album. And Frank Zappa and the Mothers of Invention were playing live at this place that they were planning to move all their equipment in and record. But it was like the night before they were going to move in and record, somebody apparently shot a flare gun and they started this place on fire and burned everything down. And so that's where all the lyrics, if you go read the lyrics or listen to lyrics or Smoke on the Water, that the song, which is the most famous guitar riff in the history of the world, was written based on a story that happened because they had this this experience in Switzerland and then they had to kind of punt, and they ended up recording the album in the Grand Hotel there, and it's all in the song. Listen to the words. Anyway, that's what they're talking about here. So when he says recorded in adverse conditions, that's an example. And they recorded one of the greatest rock riffs in the history of the world and it was under adverse conditions. Okay, Deep Purple used to keep sound equipment both in the United States and England, but updating it got so expensive, they took the American equipment back to England in late 1972. They used in 4,000-seat halls amplification they'd been using in 20,000 seaters. They suddenly appeared in the Guinness Book of Records as the world's loudest rock group. Asked if any band member has a hearing loss, Glover pretends he can't hear the question. He laughs and says, "No, we were very careful about that." And I love this line here. We point all the loudest bits of equipment to the audience. So to give the audience hearing loss so the band won't get it, obviously. Okay. We're still a loud band. We want our show to be exciting. Loud music is exciting. I like to listen to music, including classical, at a deafening volume. And that is the end of the article. Anyway, it was such an interesting time when Deep Purple had this comeback back in the mid 80s that I don't know that anybody expected it to be what it was. But when I saw them in concert on this tour, they played in an arena. They played in what was then in Denver, Colorado, it was called McNichols Arena. And I think it held 17,000, 18,000 people. And so they came back with a vengeance. They came back and they were filling these really, really big places. So they really, and interestingly, they hadn't missed a step in that way. And also interestingly, even though a lot of people, would say that, and I think you might even hear, John Lord's not with us anymore, but he'd said things to this effect, if you ever listen to interviews about it, that this album probably shouldn't have ever come out under the name Deep Purple because they'd strayed so far from what Deep Purple was as far as the band is concerned. But what I'm saying is, amazingly, the name Deep Purple, even with what they had done with it, was still carried weight. So much so that when they came back for this album, they were able to just almost, again, without missing a beat, walk right back into the big arenas. At least from what I remember, because I saw them in a big arena on this tour. They were able to do that. Nothing, even though they'd put out these albums that, like I said, some people argue they shouldn't have put out under the name Deep Purple, they had not damaged the name to the point that they were still able to play these big places. They still had the name. The name still meant something to people, and then they were able to come in here and do something really spectacular. Anyway, I hope you enjoy that stuff. I love Deep Purple, and I love talking about them, especially because there's such a fascinating history with this band specifically. It's so great. So anyway, please, if you're not following the channel already, please follow the channel. It doesn't cost nothing. Just follow and like the video. And I'd love to get your feedback too on this album, any of the interesting stuff that came out of this article. Was there anything that you didn't know, anything new in there? And also, what did you think about that stuff as we talked about, as Deep Purple kind of the Deep Purple Mark II came to a close in 1973. What did you think as they started moving on? And you get a guy like David Coverdale coming in there. We're going to spend some more time talking about those later Deep Purple albums, because some of that stuff they put out, like Burn and Stormbreaker, I mean, it was just so, from my opinion, David Coverdale was a great, even though I love Ian Gillan, David Coverdale was such a great addition to that band, and I just loved him through his entire career. He was so great. Anyway, hey, thanks for taking time to watch this video. Have yourself a fantastic day.